Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay? Appreciate the opportunity to be here today. We're going to talk about kind of the environmental assessment process, commercial real estate. It's good to see a lot of faces, familiar faces from over the years. So I imagine we've kind of got a mixed group of people that have a lot of experience dealing with environmental site assessments and the ramifications and impacts they have on your business, and probably some folks that are new. So we're going to cover phase one kind of process, and then the phase two process. John's going to talk mostly about phase two and remediation. We've got 30 some odd slides. You've got handouts that have copies of them. We talked about dimming the lights, but you've got the handouts too. So we're just going to go with this versus having everybody sit in the dark. It's probably a better way to do it. So hopefully you can see the slides okay, and we'll go ahead and get started. I've had the opportunity to talk about environmental site assessments for a long time, and one of the things that we never really start out is the why piece of it. You know, why are we concerned about this? So what's environmental risk? We're talking about risks from chemical contaminants in soil, water, and air, soil vapor, indoor air exposures, carcinogenic risks, non-carcinogenic risks, and exposure pathways. What are the exposure pathways? Inhalation, contaminated air. If you've got a building, for instance, an old dry cleaner, got contaminated soil beneath it, gets in the soil vapor, makes its way into the building, you've got indoor air exposure. Ingestion of contaminated groundwater, pretty obvious one. There's a neighbor adjacent to a chemical plant, groundwater is impacted. They're using the water for potable purposes, obviously that's a problem, and direct contact. So these are kind of the three big ones. You can see a lot of times in a commercial setting, you're not drinking the groundwater, and there's not a lot of potential for exposure to impacting soils. So this vapor intrusion risk is in a lot of buildings, in a commercial setting, is oftentimes the most important, and it's something we just recently started looking at, believe it or not. It kind of was late in the process from an environmental assessment standpoint. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, but those are kind of the big three. And it's important to say that these risks, impacts from chemical contaminants, can be isolated. We did a project last year, hexavalent chrome spill from some 55-gallon drums, hazardous waste, relatively expensive cleanup, but it went in the upper plate soils, and the excavation was a lot smaller than this room. And then also you have chlorinated solvent spills, dry cleaning solvent, TCE, those kind of chemicals, they can go a long way in groundwater. And we've been involved in projects where we have contaminated plumes that go several miles. And in a couple cases, we've been involved with, it's impacted drinking water wells for some distance. So can be isolated, or it can be a big issue depending on the geology and what the chemicals are. What's excessive environmental risk? We all have these standards, voluntary action program, Ohio EPA, we use those a lot. For generic soil direct contact standards, there's indoor air standards. They're based on commercial and residential scenarios. Both of them are based on about 30 years of exposure. Obviously, the residential scenario, longer duration at home, impact to children, which is a different scenario, and that's why your residential cleanup numbers are always going to be lower than the commercial numbers. Standards are typically based on a 1 in 100,000 excessive cancer risk over a lifetime, and a cumulative hazardous quotient for non-carcinogenic risk of 1. So basically, if the standard for a non-carcinogen is 100 parts per million, and you have 50, but you have two chemicals that both have those same standards, the one on is 50% of the hazard quotient. It's the 50 over 100 and 50 over 100. And we just use a hazard quotient of 1, saying you exceed this generic number for what the cumulative risk is. You can also generate site-specific standards. We do this a lot on underground storage tank sites where we do have contaminated soil and groundwater, but we do modeling to where the point of exposure would be for groundwater, for instance, and then we use fate transport models to kind of back calculate. So we use a lot of the generic standards, but there's also other standards that are that can be site-specific, depending on what the site use is and so forth. What do you do if you have excessive risk? And we're going to talk more about this in a minute, but you can remove it, you can reduce it, and you can prevent exposures to it. So you can have a deed restriction, says you can't use groundwater. Can't use a property for residential purposes, so that you have commercial exposure scenarios. Engineering controls, vapor intrusion barriers underneath the floor slab of the building, or like a subslab depressurization system, like a radon type system to minimize potential for migration. Clean soil cover at sites. We've worked on sites where we put down basically a self-defense type material that's orange, buried 2 feet of clean fill, and supposedly if anybody in a commercial setting goes down and sees that, they know, hey, you're not supposed to go any further. There's a direct contact risk. So eliminate it, reduce it, or control it. Those are kind of the big picture on what you do to mitigate excessive risk. So you've got a commercial real estate transaction. What do you do? How do you determine if there's potential for excessive risk? So the first step is to do an assessment. The standard phase 1 environmental site assessment, SBA record search with risk assessment. Are you familiar with those for low risk sites? There's also kind of in between, there's this environmental transaction screen, and we do some of those. It's similar to a phase 1, not as much reporting, a little less cost. There is some liability protections that are associated with meeting the all appropriate inquiry standard for an ASTM phase 1 that you don't get with the transaction screen. We don't do a whole lot of transaction screens. I know there's at least one lender we do work with that kind of has their own kind of transaction screen scope. It's kind of a in-between thing. So the SBA record search and risk assessment is kind of a nice tool. When we first ran across it 5 years ago or so, it's like, wow, we don't really have much to go with here. Are we really going to render an opinion on a site we haven't physically stepped on? And the key is to use it for the right properties. You know, this is good for that dental office that's outside of a small town, or a apartment complex that's in a residential area that's apparently appears to be always residential, those kind of things. If not, if you're next door to the gas station, whatever, you're just going to end up, the recommendation is going to be, well, go do a phase 1 now. We just reviewed some reports for a client that one of them was a scrap yard, one of them was an obvious old gas station site, the other one was in an industrial area, and they started with this scope of work, and then they moved on to the next one, and it's just time and cost. So on the next couple pages, I'm not going to go through these, but this is out of the SBA SOP 50, and it's kind of the list of all these environmentally sensitive industries. They say, hey, you don't want to, if this is at your site, currently, historically, or an adjacent property, currently or historically, you want to start with the phase 1 environmental site assessment. Evaluating environmental risk. State and federal environmental databases, Superfund sites, leaking underground storage tank sites, emergency response spill sites. A lot of good information in these databases. And the one thing I want to point out is this all started, late 70s, actually early 70s. I think it was the Nixon administration that had the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and that's where it all kind of kicked off. And they dealt with Love Canal and the Valley of the Drones and all these horrendous Superfund sites initially, because before that you could just dig a hole, bury your hazardous waste. So from about the 1980s on, we've got a pretty good record of what's going on. If you've got underground storage tanks at your site, they should be registered and they should show up, right? We should know about it. Anything prior to that, and there's a whole lot of stuff out there in Central Ohio that was developed prior to the 1980s. This information's not going to go back that far. So, and that's always the question: is what was there, and what the risk prior to that? That's where we use historical records. We go back to first developed use, historical aerial photography, city directory records about every 5 years back to first use. Fire insurance maps, Sanborn fire insurance maps, very useful. Those started around 1880s, maybe on to 1980s, but really nice information because they're fire insurance maps. They're concerned about fire risk, so they're concerned about petroleum storage and a lot of things that kind of we're concerned about as well as far as use goes. Historical topographic maps, but those are kind of the big three: fire insurance maps, city directories, aerial photography. When I first started, my dad worked for me. He'd retired, and to get this information, he would have to go to the library, and he would have to go to the Soil and Water Conservation Office, and we'd take pictures, or we'd take a little copier with us. And now we obtain all this from, there's several companies out there that have a huge inventory of all this material across the United States. We just did an RSRA in Manhattan, and that was a fun city directory review with high tall buildings. But it's impressive the information we can get relatively quickly now, and the details we have. So we're certainly a lot better off than we were 30 years ago as far as information availability. Other things we do interviews. We interview the site owner and occupants. We get information from local government officials, typically fire and health. Fire is typically the big one as far as usefulness. If we can get records from them, some places works well, some doesn't. I think the city of Columbus has finally got their system together where they had kind of a dead period for 6 months or so where they would, like, sorry, we're transitioning over to electronic records or something, wasn't it? So you're just gonna have to deal without it, which is a problem. Site features, topography, geology, hydrogeology. I mentioned these long groundwater contaminant plumes. Those are going to be in glacial outwash areas. We have deep sand and gravel. There's certain geology that's just higher risk as far as migration. We just looked at a site a couple weeks ago. Class got to buy a gas station in a small town, and I looked at it. And I'm like, this looks like sand and gravel, and it's all sand and gravel. And certain enough, like 3 doors down, there were probably wells that 40 feet deep, straddled in the upper saturated zone, and it was a 50-year-old gas station. And I'm like, there's a lot of risk here, you know. We did a project in Central Ohio where we impacted, the owner impacted probably at least a dozen drinking water wells in a small town, and they were contaminated, you know, benzene, other petroleum-related contaminants, and so they went in and hooked them all to city water, and then we spent about 10 years out there cleaning it up because the plume was moving to the well field. That would be, once you get on city water, if city water is contaminated, it doesn't matter either. So geology and hydrogeology does play a part as far as what the risk is, depending on what the site is. And then site inspection. We go out and take a look at the property, take some photographs, and look for things. Look for vent pipes, look for fill pipes, what's going on next door, you know. And we always like to get all the historical stuff first. We kind of got an idea of what the history of the site is, and gives us some ideas on where these risk items may be. So the ASTM Phase 1 standard, you'll notice in your copy it says 1527-23. It's actually a 21 standard. I apologize for the typo, but it is correct over here. Okay. So what do we do in Phase 1? Well, we get a lot of records. We get the environmental database records, state and federal environmental databases, historical records, you know, the city directories, the aerial photography, and fire insurance maps, and historical topographic maps. We have people fill out questionnaires. We interview folks. If it's some sort of manufacturing, we learn as much as we can about the manufacturing process. Oftentimes we're dealing with a building where we know it had industrial use. We know there's a name of the company that was there. We typically have some idea of what they did. The building's gone, or the company's gone. There's no employees to talk to about what they did there, and there's really no paper trail or anything that we can follow to really kind of figure it out. So oftentimes we're trying to put pieces of the puzzle together and see what the level of comfort is and see if what the potential risk is. Ideal scenario, we're dealing with an owner that's occupied the property for a long time, and they kind of know back to first developed use. That's always the ideal scenario, but if you've got a 100-year-old property, that unfortunately just doesn't happen. Visual inspections, then we put together a report, which is great late night reading, by the way. So you need some sleep, and put together a report, and it comes down to recognized environmental conditions, controlled recognized environmental conditions, historical recognized environmental conditions, business environmental risk. Those are kind of the big four. That's where we have to kind of evaluate the data and say, is the bar high enough to say that this is a recognized environmental condition? There's a lot of black and white type situations where this is obvious, this is not a problem, this is a problem. The site was a dry cleaner for 50 years. Pretty straightforward, right? But there's also a lot of gray areas in between where, you know, what is the risk to our property? They had 2 underground hydraulic lifts. They were used for a short period of time. The lift was removed. There's a potential you can have some isolated, you know, hydrocarbon contamination in soil. How does that play in, you know? And a lot of that also kind of goes back to what the risk tolerance of the lender is and what the risk tolerance of the borrower is. I know the environmental piece is just one piece of the puzzle when you evaluate the entirety of doing business with your customers as far as commercial loans. And we've certainly done sites where we have RECs, apparently lower risk, what appears to be a lower risk, and it's a client that's got, you know, a strong borrower that they have a long business relationship with. They're like, well, you know, we're not going to pursue that. I know on the SBA side, the rules are pretty strict. You know, once you get to step one, you got to go to step two. There's no going straight to closing until those are addressed. So, non-scope considerations. One of the important things to know in a phase one environmental site assessment, we're dealing with hazardous substances, petroleum products. Release, material threat of release, historical release. We're not dealing with lead-based paint. We're not dealing with asbestos-containing building materials. We're not including wetlands, mold, those things, or environmental compliance concerns. If you've got an underground storage tank system, there's a lot of compliance that goes with that. If you've got above-ground storage, you might need a spill plan. If you're in an industrial site, you might need an industrial stormwater permit, air permits. That's not part of the phase one scope. Any of those can be added. And when we do a project that's a new development site, that's first developed, it's farmland, it's got some woods, it's got a creek that runs through it, we certainly say, hey, you might want to take a look at wetlands because that can have a significant impact on the use of the property. As well as SBA has requirements for child care facilities, requires lead-based paint, lead and drinking water testing. Asbestos, if you're going to do some significant renovation or demolition on a building that was constructed, say, prior to 1980s, you might want to do an asbestos survey. So non-scope considerations can be added to a phase one, but just want to be clear on what a phase one environmental site assessment is. SBA gasoline station loans. Just want to mention there is an SOP for that. Requires a phase one environmental site assessment, and then we need to look at all the compliance records. We do a lot of gas station loans, and the key is, I mean, we can get the buster registration and the insurance. There's a mandatory insurance fund for regulated, buster regulated petroleum underground storage tanks through the Petroleum Underground Storage Tank Release Compensation Board. We can get verification of those, but the key is to get the compliance inspections. They're supposed to do monthly inspections, an annual detailed inspection. They all have automatic leak detection systems. Those need to be tested. They have spill buckets for minor spills and overfills, like around the dispensers. And at the fills, they need to test those every 3 years. There's line leak detectors. There's a lot of things that go into it. So we have to get our hands on all this information. We've got to make sure everything's passing. If it's not passing, we need to make sure it's repaired. And the important thing is not only that it's your client, it can affect the value of real estate in some respects, but if you're not in compliance with all these requirements and you have a significant release, the insurance fund can deny your release because you're not in compliance. So it's critical to maintain the insurance to make sure you're in compliance. So that's a piece of it, making sure everything's done. And then a phase two environmental site assessment if there's something that requires additional work. We just did a gas station site where all these records were good, but we had an older environmental site assessment that showed that where a used oil tank and a heating oil tank was removed behind the building, no closure on that. So we went in and did a geophysical survey. We'll talk about that in a minute, and collected some data from that site in that area, not associated with the ongoing current underground storage tank system. And then there was another issue with the ongoing underground storage tank system in that they converted from a mid-grade, high-grade, and regular gasoline to just the mid, or the low and the high, and then they put in blender pumps, which is common. So that way they can have two regular unleaded tanks, which is mostly what they sell in one high grade. Well, when you do that, you end up with an extra piping run. And the extra piping run is closed in place, and we can't do a closure assessment on it because the pipe's going to stay in the ground because it's got other piping next to it. So they let you do a closure with no sampling, real estate transaction, no triggered them to go do the sampling post-closing. So it was kind of a complicated thing. So gas station loans can be really complicated. The other thing with gas station loans is oftentimes the current underground storage tank system's fine, but it was a gas station back to the 1950s, and we know there was at least one prior generation of underground storage tanks. There's no data on that, where they're located, are there orphan tanks in the ground, those kind of things. Findings. So if we do a record search and risk assessment, we use low, elevated, or high risk. Low risk means everything passed. And state and federal environmental databases look good. Nothing in the area looks like it's a problem. First developed use of the site, for an example. Aerial photography looks good. City directories don't identify any neighbors or current or prior use of the site that represents risk. And Sanborn fire insurance maps say they look good, or they're not available. They're not available in areas that were recently developed. So, there won't be any Sanborn fire insurance maps for this building because I'm sure this was farmland probably 30 years ago, and those were gone long before then. So, if it's elevated or high risk, then you come down here and do a phase one. If you do a transaction screen, we use a little different terminology: potential environmental concerns. And then for the phase one, we have recognized environmental condition, conditional recognized, or controlled recognized environmental condition, historical REC, and BER, as I mentioned earlier. REC, likely presence of release of hazardous substances, petroleum products, and then there's also this other definition here, to be an REC, material threat of future release to the environment. So we're looking for not only storage of these materials, we're looking for signs or information that indicates there's been a release. We did a project in South High Street in Columbus, gas station for 60 years. No environmental data, never reported a release. Everyone acted like everything was good. And we're like, been here 60 years. Are we comfortable that there hasn't been a release? Is that a material threat of a release? We said, yeah, we should probably go do some borings, and we found absolutely nothing. So you never know. I mean, people say, well, what's the chance the site is contaminated? And honestly, it really varies. And we did a lot of underground storage tank closures, orphan, 100-year-old tanks, when they did a project in my old hometown, and the whole area is sitting on sand and gravel, so it's really permeable subsurface material. And all these tanks were full of holes, and we didn't find any. They were all the excavations were clean, because whatever releases they had probably happened 80, 100 years ago, and so you just never know. So it is kind of a rolling dice. So in REC, potential recognized environmental conditions, a lot of these are on that same list of environmentally sensitive industries. Obviously, any kind of storage, dry cleaners, underground hydraulic lifts, manufacturing, facilities that do like wood staining, wood treating, metal plating, all those things. Hazardous waste generators, obviously solid waste facilities, facilities and spills. Controlled recognized environmental condition is an REC in which the site's been evaluated, and we have contaminants that exceed unrestricted use. Whether you can't drink the groundwater, you can't use the site for residential purposes, but it meets the criteria for whatever the current use of the property is. We use this a lot at gas station sites where we either deem restricted for commercial, or there's enough commercial around that we can define it as commercial use, and we don't use the residential use. So as long as the property stays commercial, it's controlled. It is considered a recognized environmental condition, but it's a CREC. You're not going to have to do any further evaluation. And then we've got this newer definition down here, which is the problem. It says, well, what about new stuff, change in regulatory criteria. Obviously, a change in use, if you've got a gas station site that has a commercial land use restriction and you put a daycare in it, that's a problem. But the issues we have are, number one, 2017 the Bureau of Underground Storage Tank Regulations came out with new list of chemicals of concern for gasoline releases, which included adding trimethylbenzene and naphthalene with very low action levels. So historically, gasoline release cleanups were pretty much driven by benzene and in some cases MTBE, which was an additive, which is very soluble in water, and it was problematic. Well, now we got these other two, trimethylbenzene and naphthalene, that are typically more restrictive either than a typical release that includes, benzene and possibly MTBE. So we've got 25 years of underground storage tank closure assessment reports, NFAs, and as the lender, you're like, we've got an NFA on this site, and we look at the data, and it's like, well, is there trimethylbenzene and naphthalene there above action levels? I'm not saying that's a definite problem. It's a component of gasoline. So if you have no benzene, everything's real clean at the site, chances of having trimethylbenzene and naphthalene quite low. They're not going to be there by themselves. They would be there with that whole suite of chemicals that makes up gasoline. But that's a problem. The other problem is indoor air. 2016, Ohio EPA published their standards for vapor intrusion in buildings, primarily looking at chlorinated solvents, which is perchloroethylene, tetrachloroethylene, which is dry cleaning solvent, and trichloroethylene, which is probably the best solvent known to man, and it's been the most expensive chemical probably ever used in history from a remediation standpoint too. They're both bad actors. But we really weren't looking at that vapor intrusion exposure pathway until about 2016. Even the voluntary action program wasn't. So there's VAP sites that had NFAs through the Ohio EPA that really didn't address that vapor intrusion exposure pathway, which if you look at this building, we're not going to be exposed to the soil, we're not drinking the groundwater. If there's a significant problem with this property, it's going to be vapor intrusion into the building, potentially, if you've got volatile contaminants that are beneath the building. So that kind of throws a wrench into the CREC. Historical REC, same thing, except you meet all unrestricted use standards. So you meet the residential use standard, you drink groundwater, all those kind of things. But then we still have this other thing here that says, well, you know, Buster gave you an NFA in 2015 on this underground storage tank system, but we've got some new stuff that you haven't tested for. And so how do we handle that? And that's where the consultant has to really take a good look at the data, look at the big picture, kind of sort it out. We're certainly not saying you have to go out and collect data at all these sites that have NFAs, but I think we've got to be prudent to realize that there may be things there that weren't tested before that are a potential problem. Any questions about REC, CREX, HREX?
So
yes, sir.
If there's a vapor intrusion, doesn't the concrete slab or whatever's built over it encapsulate that or prevent it seeping out?
Comes through cracks, floor, yeah.
Sanitary lines, utilities.
Yeah, just any little crack.
It'll find it.
For tetrachloroethylene, dry cleaning solvent, there's a OSHA standard if it's a dry cleaner, what the employees can be exposed to over the life of their career. The EPA standard's 1,000 times lower than the OSHA standard. So the EPA's numbers are in my opinion, very, very conservative. And we do a lot of sub-slab. We'll talk about that in a minute, where we take samples from beneath the floor slab, because if we come in here and we take indoor air samples, we're looking at parts per billion detection limits, and you find a whole myriad of things. I'm working with an attorney right now that people bought a new house, and they thought there was something wrong with the house, so they came in, they had another consultant do some indoor air testing, and they got all this data back. Well, you know, you got stains, you got adhesives, you've got carpet. You know, it's like that new car smell. You know, if you got a car that's got the new car smell, if you collected an indoor air sample, it would probably fail for occupancy. Yeah. So you kind of have to look at it. So that house failed, not by much, when you look at cumulative risk. And I looked at the concentrations and what's typically found in the house, and all these were kind of within the typical ranges of what's detected. So we like to, if we think we've got a vapor intrusion issue, we just need to test for the vapor intrusion issue. Otherwise, this shirt came from a dry cleaner's. Not today, but if it did, it might be off-gassing some chlorinated solvent. So who knows? If you go to a dry cleaner that still uses tetrachloroethylene. So
is Ohio stricter than the United States EPA?
No. The VAP standards are well, US EPA likes to use 1 in a million excessive cancer risk. In Ohio, it uses 1 in 100,000. So from that standpoint, they're a little less. The numbers are a little more favorable as far as us consultants trying to piece it together. But and then we use it's vapor intrusion screening levels calculator, so we can put all the chemicals in, and it does all the math for us as far as cumulative risk and things. And we can set that though at 1 in a million or 1 in 100,000. And also the hazard quotient, you can use a 0.1 or a 1. We use a 1. 0.1 would be obviously 10 times more conservative. And I think that's more on like some of these hazardous waste sites and stuff. Under RECRA, they use some more conservative risk scenarios. Business environmental risk. And this is kind of the stuff that non-scope considerations are called. Things that can be added to a report, evaluated. If we see there's potential wetlands concern, we recommend, hey, if you're gonna develop a site, you're gonna have to deal with wetlands, see if the Corps of Engineers or a highway PA is gonna be involved in permitting that can really impact things, demolition, asbestos surveys, lead-based paint, and also a lot of compliance things. You know, we do a lot of gas stations, so we always put in there that hey, you're gonna have ongoing responsibilities, you know, the registration, insurance, inspections, compliance, maintenance, testing, those kind of things. And then there's others as well, like I mentioned, air permitting, stormwater permitting, those kind of things that are kind of business environmental risk. One of the things we include in our reports is the site was previously developed, might have a septic tank, might need to be required to meet health department requirements. If there's potential, they could have had drinking water wells. Just make them aware that, hey, those wells, if they are present, are going to be closed in accordance with what the ODNR requires. And that's, and the reason we do that is so we get paid to remove a septic tank on the site because they said we didn't identify it, and like it has nothing to do with our scope of work. But so now we make sure everyone's aware that there's a septic tank, and you might have to kind of a bizarre circumstance, but we all parted friends. Didn't make any money on that jump. Oh well, win some, we lose some. There's a lot worse things you can get in trouble for in the environmental business as far as issues. Any questions about PDRs as far as anything you want to?
So one of the things that we're seeing on some of the environmental reports, I'll come on this way, are a greater incidence of PDRs. And in old world where the SBA was approving our environmental reports, these had to be resolved. A secondary containment system around 755-gallon tanks, right? It might not be within the scope of the phase 1, but it's a potential risk. So those are the things that even though the SBA isn't approving them anymore, as a CDC, that is now my liability to approve those, that all has to be resolved. So what we have been doing is we are telling the borrowers and our participating lenders, this potential or this business environmental risk has to be addressed. And then the environmental professional has to go back out and take a look at it and send us an email that say it's been resolved. Because we just can't leave these hanging out there. Unless it's something, you know, I will say, one of the ones that I've seen is, it looks like the building might have been constructed prior to the 1980s, so asbestos is a potential issue. So we have a form letter that, especially if there's no construction, it's not an acquisition, there's a letter that we have the borrower sign stating that if I am going to develop this site, I affirm that I will check for asbestos and handle it appropriately. So, but just realize that right now, I've been noticing more in the past couple of years. We're gonna, you know, any SBA lender is gonna require that these have to be addressed.
If I may add, one of the things that happened to me a couple of times was there were construction materials. A building was being sold, maybe it was vacant, and then they left, like the seller left debris, and that comes up as a business environmental concern. And it's almost like you want to like nudge, say, hey, if there's trash on the site, you got to clean it up before you have your phase 1 done. Because that it just prolonged the process. Because then we had to go say, hey, well, you have to have your environmental guy. You got to go clean it out, and then have the environmental guy. And it just added an extra week to it because there was and who knows what's in the construction materials or whatever.
Yeah.
But it added a whole extra week to the process because somebody didn't clean up the trash.
Right.
So just
Is there like a checklist or something that we can provide to get ready for one of these?
For a phase 1,
Yeah, or just,
I mean, we have a checklist that we use ourselves, but really what we look at is the SBA standard that, you know, if our loan amount is $250 or less, it's a questionnaire, unless it's in an identifiable industry. Once you get above $250, then it's a RSRA, unless it's on the list, right? And then once you're on the list for the environmental, it really just depends. It's very project specific. I mean, I know when you're looking at a phase 1, there is kind of like a chart that you guys go through, like for any potential type of thing. But I would say it's pretty property specific, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah, you want to do phase 1s on everything, no matter where.
no, that's what you.
Yeah, if you're buying a car, we can do an assessment.
Oh, sure.
It is, and it's also, you know, client specific, you know, depending on who.
What
There's
I
a lot
would
of things
recommend,
go into it.
it does, I know, but what I would recommend is walk the site with your client, right? Go out and look at the site, see if there's something there that's concerning. And then if there is, go back when the environmental professional goes out to walk the site. Just so you're aware before it becomes a bigger issue.
But yeah, a good questionnaire and what questions asked. We use a questionnaire that's pretty detailed in our phase ones. I can send you a copy of it. I'm not sure that would be ideal for what your use would be, but you'd want to see, is there anything that's on that environmentally sensitive industries? Is there any, what are the risks here?
Questionnaire too, that goes through that. Yeah, but it is really specific.
Look ahead, I'm just gonna go through these real quick. Environmental database, gas station site, prior release, no further action. That looks good. That's one of the ones we'd have to ask ourselves, when was the data collected and review the report. That's obviously a finding that you want to take a further look at. Dry cleaner shows up, obviously, have some concern with that, as far as being a recognized environmental condition. City directories, bulk plant shows up here in 1959. There's another listing for the same dry cleaners. Those are the kind of things we're looking for. Industrial use, I mean, here's a greenhouse. You would think greenhouse would be fine. Well, how they heat the greenhouse, they have underground heating oil tanks. I mean, there's always a lot of questions, but we just try to get a list of what the occupants at the site, what the historical use of the site adjacent properties are. Here's an interchange. When they build interchanges, they did build embankments. They came in, built a nice pond in '71, and the 1980 it's filled. It's like, oh boy, what is that clean fill they put in there? Well, sure enough, no, it's a solid waste landfill. So those are the kind of things we're looking for. Historical topographic maps, same thing. You know, if you've got a site that's got a big valley and then that valley disappears, what's going on. Back in the day, 70 to 80, I mean, things were, solid waste rules were getting rolling, but anything prior to that, they just looked for a place you could bury stuff, mining sites, those kind of things. Sanborn Fire Insurance Map, this one showed up as a implement sales and service, but we've got these three little circles out here that say GT on for underground storage tanks. Our experience with Sanborn Fire Insurance Maps is, if they show 3 right here, there's probably 3 right there. They are quite accurate. We're always impressed when we look at these old maps. Back in the day, they would either just ignore them, they'd fill them with sand, or they would remove them. So the question is which of the 3? If it's just abandoned in place, when you remove it, you have to get a permit from the Bureau of Underground Storage Tank Regulations to go through the corrective action process. If they've been filled with sand, they were abandoned in place in accordance with requirements at the time, and they're no longer considered underground storage tanks. They're still an environmental concern. There's still risk of soil and groundwater contamination, but you're not regulated by Buster. And obviously, if they're gone, same scenario. We're still concerned about releases, impacts, soil, groundwater, potentially indoor air, but not a Buster issue.
Hey, Curt, what's your feeling on property that was historically operating as an orchard?
That's a problem. We just did one. It was a condo complex, and we went out and just did some shallow hand sampling. John just did a hotel. It was an orchard. We did some sampling. We haven't found much. Actually, the house I bought 2 years ago was an orchard. I did a bunch of testing before I bought it, and so it just depends. I mean, they used what was it, lead arsenate, which is a beautiful combination of lead and arsenic. Wonderful. And it's effective on moths. But the problem is it's incredibly persistent. They went to DDT after that, and DDT is very persistent in the environment, but it doesn't last forever.
Yeah.
Lead and arsenic are forever.
Right.
So, and they can leach to groundwater, and they can cause significant problems. The main issue at orchards is primarily where the building was, where they were mixing the stuff, storing the stuff, dumping out the leftover stuff. In the fields, though, you can still have issues. So, and that was 50s when did they ban lead arsenic? And that was DDT, and you can still find DDT in the environment. And then from there, the stuff they use now is effective, but it degrades quickly. It's not persistent. This is a fun one here. This is it was an apartment complex. It was a coal gasification facility where they would take coal and turn it into gas, store it in these gas holders, these tanks, and then you generate coal tar. And right in the middle, it says tar well, which means they dug a hole and they buried coal tar, which has got polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons, semi-volatile organic compounds, a lot of carcinogens, really not good stuff. So you never want to see that in the middle of your apartment complex. Any questions about, so we talked about what's excessive risk, and then how do you decide if you have potentially have excessive risk, environmental risk, and then we're going to talk about the phase 2 process, how we collect data, a little bit on remediation. Still have time, Jeff. No, talk. And so how do we sample these media? I'll let John just kind of roll through some pictures. We'll kind of go back through the remediation stuff that I mentioned earlier, and then have some time for some questions at the end.
Hi, everybody. I'm John Mills. I worked for Curt for about a decade now.
It's been a long time.
And I'm a Buckeye, but I think after last night, I'm a Hoosier for at least a little while. One point before we go on to phase 2s, I would like to make, though, you mentioned walking the site with your clients. There's going to be some things that we would assess as risk that you may not understand, but there's a lot of common sense too. If you're in an automotive service facility and you see an oil container and it's leaking all over the place, there's oil dry all over the floor, we're probably going to identify that as a risk. It's always a good idea to try to get them to improve housekeeping, clean up the facility. It may not alleviate our concerns, but it certainly would help. Did some work in West Virginia for a power washing facility. They did not power wash their site before we showed up, and we ended up drilling because of it. So
It's a good friend of mine too. I'm like, you guys have power washing.
yeah, so some common sense things. As far as assessing the risk that Curt mentioned, there's a few different methods. This is where we're going to go out and physically collect data. So soil, groundwater, indoor air, subslab vapor. We're going to assess whatever the risk is through these methods. I've got a laser pointer for the first time, so I'm going to take advantage of it. What you're seeing here is called a SUMA canister. This is collecting an indoor air sample. It's a vacuum canister that's under negative pressure. We set this up in an area typically that would be occupied, whether it's a commercial property or a residence. Hook the regulator onto the top, it starts drawing air in. We return, turn it off, send it into the lab. This is a sub-slab soil vapor sampling canister. It's the same type of SUMA canister, except what we've done is drill a hole through the floor, through your slab, install a pin that has negative space in between. We're essentially harvesting the vapor that is beneath that slab. So if you have any sort of volatile chemicals, whether it be in your soil or your groundwater that are working their way up beneath the slab foundation, we're going to collect that through this canister. It allows us a lot of times to differentiate between a vapor intrusion risk and an industrial hygiene risk. Like Curt mentioned, if you're a dry cleaner, those chemicals could be in the walls, they could be in any carpeting, but we want to be making sure we're taking data that's a vapor intrusion risk beneath the buildings. So this is exactly what is being sampled there. Here's another example of it. In this one, I've drilled through the floor in a hotel. It's not very pretty. The nice thing about collecting sub-slab vapor samples is you can get into a lot of areas you usually can't access with a rig. You don't have to drive a truck into somebody's building. You're not creating soil spoils. Once you're done, we remove this pin, hatch it up. It's sealed at the slab, and with the exception of maybe a little discoloration, you'd never know we were there.
This site is at a popular resort on an island in Lake Erie. And
Very popular
we
island.
get to do a phase 1 of the site. We're like, this is fun, right? And then we find out that in 50 years, the diesel power generation station is on the same property. So we didn't want to take a drill rig over. The whole site's paved and building. So we went in and did some sub-slab sampling to evaluate what the real exposure risk is, which would be vapors indoor air.
Yeah, as Curt mentioned, the site's developed. They're not drinking the groundwater, bless you. So the vapor intrusion risk is really the most appropriate exposure pathway, so we decided to just evaluate that at this site.
You guys just go down like below the slab?
We usually try to get a few inches beneath the slab. The idea is to try to generate a void space in the substrate beneath, so you can tell very quickly when you're drilling what you're into, whether it be clay or sand and gravel. But you do need a space to be able to draw that media from. If it's very tight clay, it can inhibit your ability, so you might have to drill 16, 18 inches down. We try not to do that because depending upon underground utilities, sometimes I wear electricity resistant gloves while I'm doing this because you can't see, you're not going to be able to locate those. But yeah, to answer your question, we generally try not to go too far, but we do want to be able to get enough media to have a viable sample for the lab. Next slide, we're doing drilling. It's the original environmental data collection method. The building behind this, the school system wanted to purchase. It used to be filled with 55-gallon drums of literally every chemical we analyzed for. So of course we went out to collect some soil. This is a hydraulic probe. This is a track-mounted rig. They also make these to where they're mounted on the back of the truck, about the size of an F-150. It allows us to drill. You can take shallow borings from a few feet. We drilled down to 50 plus with these for environmental sampling, depending upon the area. You're collecting soil cores. Once those come up, field geologist logs those, packages them up, field screens them, submit them for analysis. This is a little more invasive than your air sampling, but a lot of times, depending upon the risk, this is generally what we go to first.
When you do the hydraulic sealing problems, you go like multiple different areas.
Depending upon the risk. Yeah, so what we try to do with the phase one specifically is try to narrow down as best as possible the areas of concern. Without doing that, you would have to Swiss cheese the site with borings. It's not cost effective. Your clients aren't going to want to do that. And the more soil you collect, the more data you have to analyze, so you have more analytical costs. So our job is to assess the risk item, determine what would be sufficient for us to be able to get comfortable with the data, to have enough, and then we scope that out in the phase two proposal. But yeah, we try to minimize the amount we can while making sure we have enough data to where we can review that and get comfortable. The worst thing is going out to the site and drilling and coming back and realizing if I would have had one more location, I could probably get comfortable with what these results were. Sometimes we do all of these in conjunction with each other. We might collect soil and groundwater and indoor air for some slabs, so it just depends upon what that risk item is. Here we're doing, again, some hydraulic probe sampling, but the one thing we use this for, I wanted to point out, we're generating some soil spoils here. They have to drum up. Typically for phase twos, we don't install permanent wells at sites, which is cause for that soil to come up like that. Generally, once we're done, you plug the hole and you go. So there's no drum management. You don't have to worry about additional costs for analyzing that soil to see if it needs to be treated as hazardous material, trucked off site. When we do work at cluster facilities, sometimes we will generate these drums. They have to be tracked, they have to be managed properly, so it's additional cost. But just so you're aware, sometimes if you walk behind a speedway, you're probably going to see a drum with a non-HAZ sticker on it that's been there for 20 years, and it's because somebody forgot to track that, and it's going to show up in the phase one site visits that we do. Rotary drilling, another example, putting in a well, generating more soil spoils. Groundwater monitoring wells, essentially this is a permanent well we can put in to be able to come back and access this sampling point multiple times to continually monitor groundwater. You can use them to study hydrogeology. You can also use them for remediation methods if necessary at sites. We use the term permanent well a little liberally because of course you can come back and remove that. Once you're done, they can be properly abandoned. Ground penetrating radar, GPR. So if you're familiar with the Netflix documentaries where they're looking for bones and shallow graves, this is essentially what we do at sites looking for tanks. It's a very expensive looking piece of equipment that he pushes across the ground. He gets a radar signature on the screen. You can identify differences in geology. So if it's a prior excavation, you can see the difference from native soil transition to fill. You can see metallic objects, ovular objects. Where this gentleman is scanning right now is on top of three, hopefully, 20,000 gallon heating oil tanks that existed in the 40s. He's about to find. Here's an example of where we scanned GPR near a restaurant building. We located some objects with signatures that were consistent with a tank to the ground. Unfortunately, in this scenario, they were partially beneath the building. But this is a tool we'll use at the site to determine if tanks still remain or to determine prior excavation areas. Yeah, you got it.
I just wanted to mention the buster process. We use different terminology. Tier 1 evaluation is kind of like a phase 2 with permanent wells. Tier 2 is a risk assessment. So if it's an underground storage tank, it's a buster regulated site. The corrective action program is going to have a little different terminology and a number of different steps. Site remediation, lower the risk. Source removal, a couple pictures of removing contaminated soil to eliminate excessive risk. We can inject things in the subsurface. We use this a lot at sites that have free product. We bring a back truck out, we'll run a pipe down to that interface where the free product is, floating product on top of the groundwater table from the leaking tank, and we'll use high vacuum to remove that material and also to stimulate oxygen in the subsurface, which helps with remediation. Subslab mitigation system, kind of like a radon system, but it's designed for hazardous contaminants, typically some dry cleaning site, and use that to get negative pressure under the floor slab, like a radon system to prevent that. And then this is a vapor intrusion barrier, typically placed before you place the slabs. All the penetrations through the vapor barrier are sealed, and you get a nice like a landfill liner kind of concept under the building, which would prevent any vapors from entering. These are not that expensive, obviously done during construction, so if we have sites that have some potential risk, we'll oftentimes recommend this. You're going to have a moisture barrier anyways. This is a souped up moisture barrier, but it can certainly help mitigate problems down the road. Not 1 o'clock yet, so we're not too bad. Questions? And we'll be here too after if you have any questions. As environmental consultants, we certainly appreciate the opportunity to do work for clients, but we also like to be a resource. So if you see something you don't understand or something that doesn't make sense, feel free to give us a call, bounce it off of us. We'd be happy to do that. You know, sometimes consultants have different opinions. Sometimes they're from different states that have different requirements. Like I said, hopefully we can be a resource. Hopefully the lunch part definitely happened. Hopefully there was a little bit of learn part here too. So appreciate the opportunity to participate. Yes.
Just a random question, if you could set the record straight from an environmental professional. If you know that you have a site that may need extra work, can you just go straight to a phase 2, or you have to have a phase 1, then go to a phase 2? I feel like sometimes I get that from my lenders, and I guess I just want you to say that.
We can, but we don't know if we've got all the chemicals of concern and all the areas identified. So if we go out and we say, well, there was a tank over here, we can certainly go investigate that. We call that a limited subsurface investigation, but you just want to make sure that there's not other issues. Otherwise, you're not getting to that end point that you like.
So it would be your recommendation to do a phase 1 and then do the phase 2?
Yeah. If we come out and you say there was a tank here, we do a couple borings, we'll say, hey, that was clean. But it doesn't tell you if there's other impacts to the real estate. We really need to know the history of the site, the history of the adjacent properties, and really get down to the point where that we know that's the only issue we've identified. And then you know, that would be the appropriate way to do it.
A specific example, kind of the in-between of that, though, would be an assessment of an active gas station, retail fuel station. If we know they're currently under investigation for a release that hasn't been resolved yet, the phase 1 is just going to identify that as a risk item. So what we typically recommend is solve your buster issue, because you don't know how much time, how much money that's going to take to get you to the end, and then it makes sense to start the risk assessment process. Not that we couldn't do it concurrently, but the phase one is just gonna end up identifying that as an item. We run into that often where we get started down the line on a fuel station and realize somebody hit a dispenser 2 years ago and they never did anything about it, and now they're in it. So that's usually where we would come to you up front and say, hey, before we even get started spending money on this from a risk assessment standpoint, we probably should rectify the bus road share.
Political climate, yay, everything.
You know, US EPA's been on the quieter side of things, obviously. As far as new things to be aware of is PFAS. Everybody heard of PFAS? It's these forever chemicals that were part of Teflon and Scotchgard, and it's in landfills, and it's in a lot of products. And the cleanup levels, the action levels, the target levels for those are like parts per trillion, and there's really no way to clean it up. There's a lot of companies out there working on it. Patel's got a new product for destroying like a 55-gallon drum of firefighting foam, which is like pure PFAS. But that's going to be an issue. As far as new things, Ohio is really a pretty friendly state from a compliance standpoint. Ohio EPA, I do a lot of work for industry, and you know, you really have to be egregious to get a fine, you know, or enforcement. And they're pretty good to work with. You know, the environmental assessment process kind of happens outside of the EPA, and you know, we've got relatively new rules. 21 is the update of the ASTM standard, although it took them a couple of years to get, at least a year to get through the process for the renewal. I don't really see a whole lot changing. I go back and every now and then we look at a report we wrote 20 years ago, and it's like, oh boy. We kind of look at things a little differently now. We're I think maybe a little bit more conservative at times, just because we've lived in 20 years of knowing what the risk is, you know, as far as what the potential cost is to the owner. And but yeah, I think we've got a lot better tools now too, which is good as far as the phase one process goes. So
About the water discharge from data centers.
it's a lot of water. You know, it's non-contact cooling water, but the issue is if you're using groundwater, you have to add chemicals to it to keep it from scaling and those kind of things. And I don't know. There was concern of PFAS in the water, and I'm not really sure what the source of that would be unless. So that's an interesting one, but I don't know. I've done a lot of work at data centers over the last year, a lot of compliance work, and it's amazing what they're building. It's gonna. I don't know if it's good or not, you know, but I guess if there's a computer that can write our reports for us, that's a good thing. But the bad thing is they might not. That's what I said the other day. I said, before long, we're all going to be out sampling the wells. So I don't know. It's an interesting world. We really are going into a big transition here. That billions of dollars being spent to make it happen. So, but I don't really know. You know, as far as data centers, the biggest concern I have with data centers is that power use. You know, it's amazing. I mean, they're a couple of the most recent ones that are using natural gas are putting their own power plants on the sites. Yeah.
And nuclear in that space.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Once they use up all the gas, electric, the coal's all gone, then we'll have to do that.
Any other questions? Well, we'd like to give you guys a real big thanks for